Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the voice for ethics in international affairs.
I'm William Vokey. Welcome to Ethics Matter, the Carnegie Conversations. Our guest today is Dr. Joseph Nye.
In this interview, soft power guru Joseph Nye explains the origins of his popular international relations theories on power and the ethics of power. We now present Joseph Nye.
I'm William Vokey. Our guest today is Dr. Joseph Nye. Dr. Nye is Dean Emeritus of the faculty at the Kennedy School of Government. He was in the Carter and the Clinton administrations in defense, the National Security Council, and the State Department. He was a former Rhodes Scholar. His PhD is from Harvard, and he has written numerous books, very influential in international affairs, including his current book, The Future of Power. Welcome, Dr. Nye. Glad to have you with us. Thank you for coming.
It's good to be with you.
One of the things that people regularly remark about in both your writing and your public presentations is how clear they are, how very easy to follow they are, although the ideas are very complex. Is that related to your teaching? Have you worked on that?
Well, I think I do make an effort to write without jargon when possible, and I think one of the dangers for academics is if they write only for other academics, they quickly lapse into jargon and make their work inaccessible. And it might have been the fact that my father never went to college. I was a self-made man, and he often used to tease me. He said, you know, you've been in university for 10 years, and I didn't even go at all. How do you explain the value that you add for those extra 10 years? So I always thought, you know, I ought to be able to write things that my father will understand, and my mother, and my friends, and policymakers. So I try to write in a manner which is accessible, while at the same time not neglecting the academic rigor, which is important. So if one looks at this book on the future of power, the first chapter is a little bit tough going, looking at the different dimensions of power, going over the social science literature very closely, distinguishing power as a resource and power as behavior, and explaining how they relate to each other and so forth. But after working to get it clear in my mind, then I went back over the chapter and said, now, how can I use simple examples, metaphors, to explain things which in some cases are somewhat esoteric in theory? I think if more academics would try to essentially translate themselves, then the academics might have more influence on policy.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Nye, we want to talk a little bit about the concept perhaps that has at least the most popular influence is the idea of soft power and then its follow-on smart power. Could you define for us what you mean by soft power?
Power is the ability to get what you want, and you can do it through coercion, payment, or attraction and persuasion. And that third aspect, attraction and persuasion, is what I mean by soft power. Let me give you a somewhat facetious example. If I want to steal your money, I take out a gun, I shoot you, and take your wallet. That's hard power, and you have no choice. It doesn't matter what you think. If I want to steal your money by soft power, I have to persuade you and attract you that I'm a guru to whom you should give your money. That usually takes quite a while. Mm-hmm. But in the end, I steal your money either way. But with hard power, it doesn't matter what you think. With soft power, everything matters on what you think.
Well, that comes to, in a sense, the question of measurement, because it's fairly easy to measure hard power. You have X number of tanks or soldiers or bullets, occupied territory, if it's a war or a conflict. Of course, there's intangible elements of hard power, but it's much more difficult to see the consequences, the impact of soft power.
Soft power often takes longer and depends more on the perception of the target, and that's often harder to measure. But we have to be careful not to think that hard power is so easily measurable. It's true that we act that way, but it's a misperception. Power always depends on context. And so if I have 10,000 tanks and you have 1,000 tanks, we'd say I'm 10 times stronger than you. That's true of the battles fought in a desert, but if the context is a swamp, might be just the opposite, as we found out in Vietnam. So this tangibility of hard power and measurability is often misleading. With soft power, you have some degree of measurability in public opinion polls, which are a first approximation of whether a target sees you as attractive or not. Now, it's not the final outcome, it's whether you are able to get what you want that measures power. But that's a problem of predicting both for hard power and soft power.
Then, in terms of soft power, if it has cultural value and a policy roots, does that imply that those three roots need to be in consonance with each other?
It's best if they are, but they're not always. Let me give you an example. American culture often remains attractive at the time that American policy is unattractive, and that helps us overcome some bad policy decisions. So even when the Americans were unpopular because of the invasion of Iraq, nonetheless, there was still an attraction to American culture.
In terms of that difficulty between the expression of soft power and the policies, frequently American leaders, when they express values and culture, democracy, human rights, etc., are viewed as hypocritical. They're viewed as simply mouthing the words, whereas in actuality we don't do that. How do you make that appear to be real, true?
Well, that's a real problem. I mean, for a narrative to be influential in attracting people, it has to be credible. And when your actions belie your words, your narrative makes no difference. Look at George W. Bush's second inaugural address, the Freedom Agenda. It was wonderful. It's hard not to resonate to that wonderful Wilsonian rhetoric. And for Americans, it sounded great. But in much of the Muslim world, which was reacting to the invasion of Iraq, it seemed pure hypocrisy. And the public opinion polls showed it. I mean, it was regarded as valueless. On the other hand, to go back to the sources of American soft power, it's interesting to look at the effect of the election of 2008. There was a conventional wisdom, both in the United States and around the world. The American political system was corrupt. You had to have big money to get into the game. You had to have a family name to get into the game. This Americans were all hypocrites. They didn't live up to their proclamations of democracy. And then we had the election of 2008, in which we elected an African American with a Muslim-sounding name who didn't have a family dynasty or didn't have his own money. And a major British politician who I had dinner with in November 2008 said, "This is the real example of the soft power of the United States. With one election, by living up to your values, you transform the view of billions of people about the United States."
One critique of the idea of soft power is that it's kind of a thinly disguised argument in favor of American imperialism, that it takes a kind of a Western view of how the world should be. Democracy, human rights, democratic institutions, kind of the West, not just American, but kind of a Westernization of things.
Yeah, I've read that by a number of critics, and it simply illustrates people who don't understand the concept. There's nothing American about soft power. China is trying to increase its soft power. If it's Western,
I think Hu Jintao.
Yeah, Hu Jintao says we need to increase our soft power, and they're spending billions on it. If it's American imperialism, then why aren't the Chinese able to use it? Why is Norway able to have soft power? Singapore has soft power. I mean, this kind of trendy leftist criticism that it's all American hegemony and that's all I'm writing about just means people haven't thought very hard. They haven't really looked at the concept and understood it.
Mm-hmm. One of the key things, of course, behind soft power is the values that get represented and seen around the world. And I think you argue that those values are very traditional American values. And that in a sense, is a concept of American foreign policy that you share with neoconservatives. That sense that American values are crucial and important to the narrative that we have in the world. How are you differentiated from them then?
Well, it probably by means rather than by ends. I don't think you impose soft power or American values at the point of a gun. There's another way of exercising soft power, which is going all the way back to John Winthrop and the city on the hill, your example. Ronald Reagan picked this up. He called it the shining city on the hill. But by living up to your values, you can attract others. But again, these are American values which are attractive in some places, but not others. For example, American democracy and American culture may be attractive in Brazil and not in Saudi Arabia, a conservative society. And even in Iran, a Hollywood film may be seen by the mullahs who rule Iran as the great Satan, but it may be that a younger generation of Iranians want nothing more than a Hollywood video to show in the privacy of their home. So the same artifact, the same cultural resource, let's say a film or a Hollywood film, may create soft power in the mind of a younger Iranian and destroy soft power in the mind of a mullah.
You have been remarkably effective in translating ideas into the public process, into the public discussion. Soft power is an intellectual idea that everyone talks about, even if everyone doesn't understand. What kind of impact do you think you have had, both in policy and in popular parlance?
Well, I've been surprised at the way the concept of soft power has taken off. When I was first using it, or developed it in 1989, it was an analytical concept to try to explain one of the ways in which one would measure power when one was assessing whether America was in decline or not. And but what's interested me is to see an academic or an analytical concept, which I think somebody pointed out to me, it's not even in the index of my book, of the first book, how that has become picked up and used. When I wrote a book on soft power in 2004, I deliberately put in there that soft power doesn't solve all problems. Hard power still remains important. And the ability to combine hard and soft power is smart power. And that depends on contextual intelligence, knowing which situations you want to have more hard in the mix and more soft in the mix. When you talk about influence, I was intrigued that when the Obama administration came in and her confirmation hearings for Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton talked about smart power being the theme of the Obama administration. Again, I was somewhat surprised, pleased. So I think the ideas have apparently had more impact on political discourse than I would have expected.
Do you see them having an impact not only on the discourse, on the way people talk about things, but the way people act? For instance, do you see more money being put into American soft power?
Well, yes and no. It's interesting that Robert Gates, when he was Secretary of Defense still in the Bush administration, he gave a speech in Kansas City in 2007 pleading for more investment in soft power. And he said it's odd that you might think the Secretary of Defense would odd to have him pleading for more money for the State Department. But he said that's what we need for a successful strategy. We've got to invest more in soft power. But if you look at the Congress and the general attitudes, it's a lot easier to get money for defense budget than for the State Department. And there was one account which dealt with particularly aid budget in the Defense Department budget, where the Defense Department asked that it be shifted to state. And when it was shifted to state, the congressional committee responsible cut the budget in half. Had nothing to do with the nature of the program. They were willing to fund it fully. The Congress was willing to fund it fully when it was defense. But when it went to state, they cut it in half. So our political culture still hasn't caught up with smart power how to really integrate it. We use the words in the discourse, but in practice, we have a political culture and a congressional culture which is willing to pour a lot of money into hard power and not very good at thinking about how to integrate soft power into the mix. I mean, I jokingly call myself a liberal realist, but that's mostly to say that I think these great terms, liberalism versus realism, are oversimplified. And so we developed different models for how to think about world politics, one of which was a realist model, another which was a structural realism for a particular issue, not globally, and the third, which was the area that we called complex interdependence, in which transnational actors were crucial. And we did that by essentially almost replacing the basic assumptions of realism. If realism says the state is the only actor and military is the only instrument or the dominant instrument and security is the major objective, you said there's some aspects of world politics that don't fit that model. But today, the European Union would be a good example. And what would world politics look like if you reversed those assumptions and said non-state actors play a major role, they use other means than military, and they have other goals than security? What would world politics look like? So he contrasted two ideal types, an ideal type of realism and an ideal type of complex interdependence, and argued that in the world as it exists, there's some relationships that are close to the realist end of the spectrum and some that are close to the complex interdependence end of the spectrum, European relations or US-Canadian relations, for example. And that what one needed to do good analysis was not to fall into the trap of thinking you use one model to explain everything. You have to pick the model that fits the context or situation you're explaining. And that's why I consider myself both a realist and a liberal, and call it liberal realism.
Well, let's talk about some of the key concepts then, because you've already just explained complex interdependence. You speak of multiple layers of polarity in a system. Is that essentially where that has evolved today?
Yes, in part, in the sense that I sometimes talk about this, that power today is distributed like a three-dimensional chessboard, that the top board of military relations, which is, if you want, the area of realism, tends to be a unipolar world with the Americans the superpower. But the middle board of economic relations tends to be multipolar, that Europe, China, Japan, and others can balance American power. But the bottom board of transnational relations, things that cross borders outside the control of governments, whether they be terrorists or financial flows or climate change and so forth, this is chaotically organized. And this is an area where essentially you can't imagine solving climate change by bombing China, or you can't really think that the major players are simply governments, because there are lots of other actors that are involved. And so this comes to a much closer approximation of complex interdependence.
Mm-hmm. We get a fairly simplistic view sometimes that the internet and the ability to communicate, the kind of a mass democratization of ideas, Twitter, Facebook, that is the driving force. How do you put those technological factors?
Well, I think what technology has done is accelerated a lot of this communication. There have been information revolutions in the past. After all, Gutenberg basically produced the Protestant Reformation, but it took a lot longer. What's different today is that it's all so much faster and cheaper, which means many more people play. So the impact of the information revolution has been to speed up these processes and broaden them to include many more parts of the population. Now, what's the effect of this? It's both good and bad. It doesn't just produce complex interdependence, it can also produce some nasty outcomes. The ability to communicate on the internet was used by Osama bin Laden to basically recruit and coordinate for an attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. So this reduction of the barriers to entry, which the internet communications technology has produced, enables or empowers good people and bad people. And technology is more or less neutral per se. It can be used for good or for bad.
So virulent nationalism, for instance, is also something that has that kind of spread.
Yes, one of the great ironies is that you'd think that with a technology which is transnational and knows no borders, that it would produce cosmopolitanism. It doesn't. It's quite fascinating if you look at China today to see that the blogosphere is very nationalistic. I mean, there are over 400 million Chinese on the internet, but a lot of the expressions you get on the internet are not one world of cyber utopians, but are really quite narrowly nationalistic in Chinese terms.
And that has become a support for the Chinese government.
And the Chinese government not only feeds that, but counts on it. But in turn, they've unleashed a sorcerer's apprentice, which essentially influences them. So top Chinese leaders actually are influenced by the blogosphere, even though this nationalism of the blogosphere is one of the things they've contributed to.
In the last piece of our discussion, I'd like to come to something that is at the heart of the Carnegie Council's issue, which is ethics. Where does ethics fit in this whole discussion of multiple layers, a complex international community, soft power combined with hard power to be smart power? Where does the ethical dimension fit?
Well, morality is a power reality. People don't live by the sword alone, they also live by the word. And as humans, we're guided by both, by what is in our interests, but also by what is right. And it's not always might that makes right. Sometimes people do things that surprise us because of an ethical concern. People who burn themselves in protest against authoritarian, unjust government, as we just saw recently in Tunisia, and then have an enormous impact in terms of a moral position. So I think ethics are tremendously important. That's why I think the work of the Carnegie Council is so important, to get us to think carefully and rigorously about how we can introduce ethics into this. When you have a moral position, it helps your soft power as a country. When you are not true to your moral position and you create hypocrisy, you undercut your soft power. Now, we can't always live as though the world were a perfect world in which we could live ethically. We sometimes have to make hard choices. But it doesn't excuse us from thinking about ethics. We ought to know what we're doing if we make such choices.
The old dictum is that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Is that true? Does power corrupt?
Oh, I think there's good empirical evidence. Psychologists have done tests that too much power is corrupting. Power is like calories in your diet. Too much is bad for you, and too little is bad for you. And trying to get the balance right is difficult.
And in that regard, and in terms of an ethical approach, is there a distinction to be made between individual ethics and the ethics of a person in a responsible position in state, or state ethics?
There is, and it's hard because when you are a leader of a state, you are a trustee for people. And you might find that you have to do things as a trustee for the interests of people that you might find distasteful in your own personal ethical system. I often explain this to my students by saying that when you're picking a roommate, you want somebody who firmly believes thou shalt not kill. When you're picking a president, you might not want a pacifist. And so there is a difference between some of the in the ethics of the statesman and the ethics of the individual, but we don't want to overdo that. We don't want to say that because you're running a state, that a man or a woman who is head of a state has free license to do whatever they want. But it does make the problem of calculating their ethical duties more difficult than when we try to make decisions in our private lives.
Any last comments about where you think these issues are going in the future? Where you think these concepts and this issue of ethics in international affairs is going in the next 10 years?
Well, I think what I argue in this book is that the 21st century is going to be profoundly shaped by this information revolution. More people have more information than any time in history, and they can use that to do good or to do ill. And our job is to figure out how to combine hard and soft power into smart power strategies that enable the good and discourage the bad.
With all of the caveats you've just given us about the role of power.
That's right, and it, as I used the metaphor before, it's like walking a tightrope, and you wobble, and you got to be careful not to fall off.
Well, we've been talking to Dr. Joseph Nye, Emeritus Dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard, a member of 2 administrations and 3 major institutions, National Security Council, State Department, Defense Department, and a prolific and noted author and commentator. Dr. Nye, thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.
We hope this program has been informative and has provided some perspective on the underlying ethical issues.
Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the voice for ethics in international affairs. For more information, see www.carnegiecouncil.org.